one from a bishop who's a... Yes, I will.
Just get going there, David.
Okay, everybody, we got your attention here. We're going to get going, and we want to give our speakers as much time as possible. I just want to, you've got a biography of Jeff Johnson from Focus on the Family. I just want to introduce him and to thank him for being with us, to help us to do what Focus on the Family has been doing forever, building our family and our youth into strong followers of the Lord. Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Before I start, I need a volunteer. How about you? Thank you for volunteering. Just pass those out. That tells a little bit about what I do at Focus on the Family. I'm an analyst where I research issues and read about them and write about them for the ministry. Primarily LGBT issues, but also education. And then because the LGBT issue is so far-reaching, religious freedom, free speech, all kinds of other areas where that reaches out. And so that just tells you a little bit about who we are. And there's a QR code on the back where you can go to the website and sign up. We have 2 newsletters, a daily news roundup and then a Friday newsletter. Thank you so much for having me here. I am encouraged to see God's little platoons working in so many different areas. I was looking at all the ministries down there, and I'm not Lutheran, but being exposed to this encourages me to see what you all are doing. So it encourages my heart. I've been involved in dealing with the issue of homosexuality almost my entire life, from the time I was about 5 years old, 4 years old. And I'll talk about that a little bit this morning personally. And then secondly, I've been involved in the church, helping run support groups, healing prayer, listening prayer with people struggling with homosexuality and transgenderism. And then for the last 18 years, I've worked for Focus on the Family. Some of my work has involved ministry to families, but some of it, a lot of it now, has been involved in the culture and policy issues and encouraging Christians and pastors and families to get involved in those issues and to do something to begin to transform the culture. So I have 45 minutes to share everything I know from the last 60 years or so, right? Good luck. But even though I've been dealing with this a lot of my life, I have never seen anything like what's happened in our country in the last 5 or 10 years. And not just our country, in the West as well. 10 years ago, June 26, 2015, our U.S. Supreme Court redefined marriage to be something it had never been before. They said it was the union of any 2 people rather than the union of a man and woman, which is what marriage had always been for all time and everywhere. That year was a turning point when same-sex marriage was codified into the law. LGBT activist individuals and organizations shifted their time and energy and money, which were considerable, into pushing the transgender agenda and transgender issues. That same year that the Supreme Court made that decision, we saw Caitlyn Jenner on Variety magazine, and it also was the introduction of a show about Jazz Jennings' little boy named Jared, I think, who showed his whole process of being mutilated and damaged by puberty blockers, hormones, and surgeries to a large audience, and a lot of that audience was young people. And so millions were poured into changing public opinion, and all that money that went to redefining marriage got pushed towards transgenderism and also other issues like kink and poly. And if you want me to talk about that, we'll talk after I'm done here. There are many things I can point to that would show you where we are today, but just one example I think will have to suffice. A 2024 Gallup poll reported LGBTQ+ identification in the U.S. continues to grow, with 7.6% of U.S. adults now identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or some other sexual orientation besides heterosexual. 7.6% of adults. Almost 30% of Gen Z women identify as LGBTQ. compared with almost 11% of Gen Z men. And this survey was 18 to 25-year-olds. It was adults in that generation. Among millennials, 12% of women and 5% of men have an LGBTQ plus identification. Comedian and political commentator Bill Maher joked about this on his show. He says, if we keep following this trajectory, we will all be gay in 2054. But it has been an incredible trajectory towards these issues. And it's a difficult issue to deal with because you have the culture side and the personal side. And on the culture side, you have activists who said they wanted diversity and equality, but there really has been an agenda and a movement to normalize and celebrate homosexuality and transgenderism, which has reshaped every aspect of the Western culture, from education to business and advertising to law and politics to news media and social media to the arts and entertainment and family and religion. And God calls us, the church, pastors, church members, all believers, to stand for truth in this chaotic moment. Truth about identity, sexuality, marriage, parenting, and family. But when we talk about LGBT issues, we're also talking about people. And that's what makes it difficult, because you have the cultural issues and then the personal issues. You're talking about adolescents and teens and adults who are romantically and sexually attracted to other members of the same sex. Talking about sexual behaviors and addictions, children and adolescents and teens confused about their sexuality and their identity. And then as well as the individuals, you have parents and wives and families who are affected by these. So we have the cultural issues where we have to stand for truth in love, and the family issues where we have to stand in love with the truth as well. But that can be difficult. God calls us to have a heart for these individuals and to reach out with love, grace, and truth. And he wants us to stand firmly for truth in the public square. So there's this tension at times between pushing back against the LGBT agenda, the social and policy issues, and reaching out with love to those individuals and families struggling with this. Now, obviously, I can't answer all your questions in 45 minutes, but I'll do my best, and here's what we're going, where we're going. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, and I'm doing this so that you'll have a sense of what might be going on inside someone who's struggling with these issues. And as well, especially for pastors or counselors or leaders, I hope it gives you things to think about when you're dealing with somebody who's struggling with these things. What kind of issues are going on, what's happened to them, what their lives might have been like, questions to ask. And then I want to take a high-level look at some of the ideology behind homosexuality and transgenderism and the effects of that ideology on the church. And then I'll try to give you a few ideas for equipping churches and families to understand these issues and respond with grace and truth. So I grew up in a Christian home in, that's where we're going, by the way. Grew up in a Christian home in San Diego, California. Went to a Plymouth Brethren church, which is probably to the right of the Wisconsin Lutheran Church. Am I right about? Anyway, I grew up knowing the Bible. That was a big emphasis in our church on knowing the Bible, doing right, evangelism, sharing the gospel. I got saved when I was 4 years old, and growing up, I was the good kid. I watched my older sister get in trouble. I knew what not to do, and so I didn't get in that much trouble. I was very involved in Sunday school, in the youth group, the choir, student government, speech and debate. I got good grades. But much of the time, even as a child, I was struggling with loneliness and depression. And then as an adolescent and teen, after I discovered pornography and masturbation, I was horrified when my attractions in pornography was towards the men in the pictures. And I felt shame and guilt and fear. I prayed for years that God would change me and take this away from me. So I did what most good Christian boys do. I hid my issues. I didn't talk to anybody about this. Nobody was talking about this in the 60s and 70s as I was growing up. I still believed what the Bible said about marriage and sexuality, and I wanted to serve God I wanted to marry and have children, but I had this deep struggle going on inside. So I hid this, and I worked really hard to try and please God. I worked as an intern at a local church in San Diego, and then I did a year of mission training and spent 2 years overseas in Australia as a missionary. When I came back, I went back to school, and I was working as an intern at another church. Like I said, I was really big on doing things for God, kind of an overachiever. The youth pastor invited me to a conference called Hope and Healing for the Homosexual. This was in 1985. And my first thought was, he knows. God told him. And I didn't even believe God talked to people at that point in my life. But I went to that conference, and that was the first time I ever heard anyone talk about how they'd left homosexuality, and then there might be some reasons for my same-sex attractions. Now, I do believe in the fall, in original sin and indwelling sin and our own active sin. So I know that I'm culpable and that I'm responsible. But telling somebody your homosexual attractions are because of the fall isn't always very helpful. And there are factors that cause people, that move people in different directions. And it's not just that these things happen, it's also how we respond to them. So it's also relational, it's our responses, it's things that happen to us, and these can be influencing factors. I'm not going to use the word cause, because nothing causes somebody to be gay, just like nothing causes somebody to struggle with pornography or drug addiction or alcohol or lying or stealing. But there can be things in our backgrounds which influence in a certain direction. So I'm going to talk to you about some things that happened in my life. The first factor is my personality. I was a shy, fearful, smart, hypersensitive child. That colored how I saw myself, how I saw other boys, my family, and the world around me. Another important factor for me was early involvement in sexual activity with other little boys. I was about 4 and 5 and 6 when I was involved in sexual play. And for me, that had almost the same effect as a molestation, where I felt deep shame and guilt. And again, most 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds, they don't go and talk to their parents about this. It's not something you hear about. It's not something anybody's talking about. As a result of those experiences, I began to isolate from other boys. I pulled back at just the age when you're supposed to engage with other boys. 5, 6, 7 years old, all through elementary school is when a same-sex peer group is very important for boys and for girls. But I had pulled away. I was disconnected from my father, who is a boy's primary model for masculinity and growth into manhood. I didn't trust him or feel safe with him. And I was very overattached to my mom and my sisters. There were times when I was very young when I wanted to be a girl. I have no doubt that if I were growing up today in a public school, especially in California, that I would have been steered that direction by teachers or counselors. As a young child, then, I was very detached from my innate sense of masculinity and my identity and what that meant for me. Then as an adolescent and teen, as I said, then came the struggles with pornography and how that influenced my thinking and behavior, as well as conflict over my sense of identity. I wrestled with the question, was I gay? And I fought that for years. A lot of focus on not being gay, not being gay, not being gay. What was I focusing on? Being gay. It's like when you're on a diet and you're focusing on not eating chocolate, not eating ice cream, not eating candy. You're focusing on the negative rather than becoming who you're meant to be. People struggling with homosexuality and transgenderism have brokenness in their past. That affects their sexuality, identity, attractions, thoughts, and behaviors. Not all of these are true for everyone, but they were factors for me. And again, I'm not blaming anybody for my struggles. I've had to deal with confession and repentance and the sin in my heart. But these were events that shaped me, and the ways I responded to them shaped me as well. And I think if we understand this and approach people understanding that we're dealing with deep brokenness, it gives us compassion and love for them. And it may guide, if you're involved in pastoring and counseling, how you deal with them. I'm going to throw up a resource slide. Oh, that didn't come out very well, did it? Sorry about that. I'll throw it up again at the end. We have a lot of resources that focus on the family. I'm just going to leave that up there while I'm talking about what God did to bring healing and transformation to me. It was after that conference that I understood that there were people who had left homosexuality and there was help for me. This was 1985. There weren't tons of resources out there. There's a lot of things out there right now that weren't available at that point. But I got involved in a support group for people leaving homosexuality. I started seeing a counselor. I started reading books on this subject. And God brought up a lot of things in my life and began to heal some things. He began resolving my relationship with my dad. I grew to understand my emotions, to acknowledge them and feel them and express them appropriately. I began to understand that my identity was not in homosexuality, but was as a man made in the image of God. All this helped for a while, but about 2 years in, I went through a dark time. I was on the verge of giving up my faith, tired of doing the right thing all the time, and I got into a romantic, emotional, and sexual relationship with a guy from the support group I was going to. It's one problem with support groups for guys leaving homosexuality. You meet other good Christian boys in those groups, so not always helpful. I'll be honest, the relationship felt good. Even water from broken, muddy cisterns can taste good if you're dry and empty. But I also felt miserable. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, and I walked around feeling that way for about a month. This relationship, it felt good, but it hurt. My stomach hurt for about at least a month. I struggled with my relationship with God, and when that relationship ended, I started doing some scary things, meeting guys and having sex with guys that I didn't know, which is neither safe nor smart. I was deeply conflicted, really struggling, and I was a believer at this point. I'd believed since I was 4 years old. But finally I decided I had to make a choice, Christianity or homosexuality. And I decided that I would follow Jesus even if I never changed, even if these feelings never went away. So I decided to do something a little different. I went back to a church and I said, okay, homosexuality is a relational issue. We're broken in relationships. Healing comes through relationships. So I'm not going to do anything for God at this church. I'm just going to focus on building healthy relationships with other men. And it was through those relationships I came in angry and crusty and tired, broken and weary, and there was a group of men at that church that loved me. There was a guy that discipled me. There were 2 guys I met with for accountability. Not even accountability, just to relate to each other and connect with each other. We met for a year, and then I met with 2 other guys for 2 years. And God began to bring healing in a lot of areas. He had to change my view of him. I had to learn how to receive healing through the Holy Spirit, through inner healing prayer. There was deliverance from demonic oppression. I worked at developing a heart of gratitude during this time period. There was confession and repentance and receiving prayer, all the normal things that should be part of a normal Christian life and normal Christian discipleship. And God began to bring healing into my life. I want to be clear, this was not a 180 from gay to straight, but it was healing and ongoing progress in a lot of areas of my life. And God's constantly still surprising me with bringing up stuff from my past, changing my thinking, challenging my thinking, and bringing healing to me. I'm going to fast forward a bit here. I met a gal, and I thought, oh, she's kind of cute. So we dated, broke up and dated, and there, you can ask her for the long version if you ever meet her. But yeah, it was about a 3-year process, and I would not have gotten married if it wasn't for those men in my life who said, you're whole enough to be married. You're a whole enough man to enter into this relationship. Marriage doesn't mean I'm totally healed or that I don't struggle, but I'm very different from the way I was 40 years ago. I'm not who I, or 30 years ago. Marriage is a blessing, and as our children, it's a gift from God. We moved from San Diego to Baltimore a few years after we married, so all my kids are Baltimoreans. Thanks. And I worked in ministry to those struggling with sexual and relational brokenness and to their family and friends. Then 18 years ago, we moved to Colorado Springs to work with Focus on the Family. So they're the boys. They grow up so fast, don't they? I want to talk a little bit about where the culture is today with these issues. First, the world around us has shifted almost completely from the way it was 50 years ago and completely from the way it was 100 years ago. I want to talk about the LGBT ideology. This is a belief system. It's a system of thinking that has affected our whole world. So first, let's look at some of the cultural beliefs about what people call sexual orientation, and then we'll look at gender identity, and then we'll look at some of the consequences of the LGBT agenda if I have some time enough to do that. Otherwise, I'll skip ahead and we'll talk to about some practical things that you all can do. First of all, this is what our culture believes about sexual orientation. It's seen as a solid, scientific, well-defined concept. I listened to the Supreme Court debate on Tuesday about whether or not counselors can help minors with unwanted homosexuality and transgenderism. And the counsel for the state of Colorado kept talking about sexual orientation as if it were this innate, immutable thing that defined a person completely. But that's what most of our culture believes. But it's not. It's a subjective thing based on people's thoughts and feelings and actions. In fact, sociologists, when they're trying to, if you ask a sociologist, how many gay people are there? They look at three different things. They look at attractions, identity, and behavior. And some of those things overlap for some people. Some people have all three. Some people only have one or two. They don't really know how to measure it because you're dealing with something subjective inside. But this has become an identity that people believe is immutable. Used to be a sin 200 years ago, then it became a disorder in the psychological world, and then it shifted and morphed into an identity. And that's one of the things that makes it hard to deal with, because people believe this is who I am. And even in the church, we use this language. People will say, he is gay, or they'll talk about being gay, or I am gay. So it's become this identity that is seen as the core of who a person is. It's seen as immutable and unchangeable. And not only that, it's seen as harmful to try to even change these aspects of yourself, to try to change behavior, to try to change your identity. Well, we know one of the first things God does for us is change our identity. We become a child of the Father. So I'm not identified as a homosexual or a gay man, and I don't even use that language generally, but I become a child of the Father. And yet our world says that that kind of change is impossible, and it's harmful to try and to even try to do so, and it doesn't work. Sexual orientation is seen as the essence of a person, and it defines personhood. It has become a core identity, and this is a real philosophical shift in our world, but it's something we have to deal with and talk about in the church. And it becomes a problem as well when you're trying to connect with people, even Christians with these issues, because they think this is who I am. But for me, it was a real core shift to think, you know, I'd worked so hard on not being gay, to go, oh, that's a false identity. That's not who God made me to be. I'm made in his image as a man, first of all, and then as a believer, I'm his son. And where we are now is that there's an ever-growing number of sexual orientations. Most of us just think about the L, the G, or the B. But because we have all these new gender identities, which I'll talk about next, each of these gender identities has to have somebody who's attracted to it, and so those are seen as sexual orientations as well. Beliefs about gender identity. Gender is seen as separate from a person's bodily sex, being male or female. It's disconnected from the body. It's actually a social construct, people, and an individual construct. People are making up new gender identities every day. If you want to, look up neogender or xenogenders on the internet, and you'll find hundreds and hundreds of different genders out there that people are making up for themselves. Cake gender, cloud gender, all kinds of stuff. In our culture, gender is seen as learned, a social construct. It's seen, and don't expect this to all be coherent and make sense, because it's seen as fluid and changeable, but it's also seen as immutable at the same time. So there's a lot of contradictions around this whole concept. It's seen as fluid and changeable. It's a subjective internal experience. You can't know my gender unless I tell you. And some people might have a multitude of genders inside of them, or they can shift from day to day. But you can't know what it is. It's subjective until a person tells you. And yet at the same time, even though it's disconnected from the body, drugs, hormones, and surgeries are needed to make a person's body match what's in their head, their gender identity. And as I said, there are an infinite number of genders, so there have to be corresponding sexual orientations to be attracted to all those genders. Some beliefs about both sexual orientation and gender identity. And you can see from these beliefs why every part of society has to be transformed to go along with this ideology. A person's sexual orientation or gender identity must be affirmed by society, by other people. Attempting to change that is harmful and doesn't work. And then this is really important for Christians. Those in the world who are caught up in this ideology, those who are homosexually identified or transgender identified or their allies, they see a straight line from what we teach about biblical sexuality to LGBT suicide and violence against people who are struggling with these issues. Because we're teaching something that is totally opposed, Christianity is teaching something totally opposed to this ideology, it's harmful. The counsel at the Supreme Court said this: if you tell a kid this is not who you are, it damages him and brings shame and leads to self-harm and suicide. Radical beliefs about homosexuality and transgenderism go even further, because LGBT ideology or queer theory has its roots in Marxist ideology, and it links to critical theory and critical race theory. Now, I can't go into all this at once, but critical theory and Marxist ideology divides the world into oppressors and the oppressed, the victimizers and the victims. And so it sets up a scale where you are either an oppressor or you are oppressed. And LGBT people are seen as oppressed. So that's the connection to Marxist ideology, and that's why critical theory and critical race theory embrace both homosexuality and transgenderism, and they work towards the dismantling of normal social functions like family, marriage, parenting, identity, because those things are seen as harmful because they lead to these two groups of oppressor and oppressed. Homophobia and transphobia are seen as systemic and endemic in society. LGBT-identified folks are the oppressed, they're victims, and we heterosexual, cisgender people are oppressors, and our entire way of life, including families and churches, must be disrupted and dismantled. And it's important to understand these beliefs have spread into the church. I guarantee that there are kids and adults in your churches and in your ministries that believe this, that LGBT people, it's their identity, it's who they are, it can't be changed, and they are oppressed. Now, it is true that many people struggling with this have been victimized and harmed individually. That is true, but at the same time, the LGBT movement and those financing it are very powerful and well-funded at the same time. So as a movement, as a group, they're not victims. They're very powerful and well-funded. And in the church, there's three issues that I'm constantly coming up against. And there's groups that even go around training people to believe these. Man, those are a mess, aren't they? I don't know if it's the width or I don't know what it is. Sorry about that, guys. If anyone wants my notes or my PowerPoint, I'll send it to Kathleen, and you can get my notes, which might be a little bit of a mess too, and the PowerPoint. In the church, we get some of these same beliefs, that homosexuality and transgenderism are a person's core identity, that transformation and change is impossible, and that there are groups who take what they call a missiological approach to homosexuality, and they go around training others in this idea. And the idea is that LGBT people are like a separate ethnic group or separate racial group. And so they're all identical within that framework. And so they're misleading the church on these issues. And it gives LGBT-identified folks a victim status. I heard a pastor many years ago, he said, you know what the problem with being a victim is? You're a victim. You have to think about that one a minute. Who wants to be a victim? You know what happens to victims? They get victimized. And that's not our identity in the Lord, but these people are going around in the church teaching that LGBT people are all victims, that their identity is rooted and grounded in their so-called sexual orientation or sexual attractions. Now, the effects of LGBT ideology, how am I doing on time? Okay, 15 minutes left? Okay, I'm just going to race through this next part because you have seen the effects of LGBT ideology, and you can read my notes about it too. Personhood has been redefined. Being male or female has been redefined. Marriage has been redefined. Parenting has been redefined. That's a lot in and of itself. Non-discrimination laws have been rewritten, and homosexual identity, sexual orientation, and gender identity have been elevated to the same status as race, sex, and religion. And so this pits religion against LGBT identities and ideology, which is why we're having all this conflict and court cases about these issues. Education mandates, if there are people who are born this way and this is who they are, and that trumps biological reality, then we need to reach those little kids at 4 and 5 and 6 and start teaching this in the public schools so they'll know who they are. So there are states like Colorado and California and Illinois and New Jersey and Massachusetts, other places, where it's mandated to teach about LGBT identities in all the social studies from K through 12. It's also been mandated to teach about it in sex ed. This is where we are today, and this is the effect of this ideology. And then we've seen assaults on religious freedom, adoption and foster care agencies, florists, bakers, wedding planners, you know about those cases, shutting down free speech. And that has happened both at the legal level and then more soft totalitarianism on social media as people get doxxed for saying the wrong thing about homosexuality or transgenderism. Threats to parental rights. I have a friend who's working with 38 different families in Colorado where Child Protective Services or the courts are trying to take children away from a parent because they won't transition that child with very damaging and very powerful drugs, hormones, and surgeries that have life-altering effects on children's brains and bodies. So there's a threat to parental rights, soft totalitarianism, the usurping of women's rights. That's probably the one that's gotten the most attention, is what's happening in women's sports and in their loss of privacy and safety in sex-segregated places. Say that 3 times fast. The sexualization and confusion of children, and then irreparably damaging bodies and minds of children, adolescents, teens, and adults. So how do we help churches and families navigate this issue? That's a lot, I know. First of all, don't feel like you have to do everything at once. Because, one person isn't going to change our entire culture. But you can do one thing. So pick one thing and do it. And then maybe pick another thing and do it for a while that's related to this issue. I want to give you, first of all, a paradigm for believers. There are a lot of people who think we shouldn't talk about these issues in the church. But these are biblical, moral issues, and so we must talk about them in the church. And I believe our Father's heart gives us a paradigm for how to approach this. God's love is fierce, and so he fiercely wants to protect children and women and all of us from lies and falsehood. And so he is fierce in his truth and in proclaiming the truth. But his love is fierce, and it's also gentle. It reaches out to individuals with grace and mercy and healing and deliverance and transformation. And it's very hard to keep both of those at the same time, not one or the other, but both at the same time. And so I believe that we have to speak out in the public arena with truth, but also with grace, that fierce love that wants to protect people. And we also have to reach out to individuals with love and grace. So what can you do? And I'm not going to be talking about like how to counsel a struggler or how to deal with family members. That would be a whole nother 5 sessions probably. Some practical things for you and your ministry. First, ask God to experience his heart yourself. You can't give away what you don't have. And so we as leaders need to experience God's deep love for us. It took me many, many years before I had experiences of God's love. I was so disconnected emotionally and unattached from people and from God. It took me many years before his love was able to break through. But we have to experience his heart. If you're talking about these issues in church and you don't have love for people and you haven't experienced God's love in your own heart, people can tell. I know when somebody's talking about this issue and they don't have God's heart of love and compassion, even as they're dealing with the difficult truths about this issue. And you know who else can tell? Your kids and your teens, your adolescents. They can tell. So we have to experience God's love first. Ask God to build his heart into your church and your ministries. And then thirdly, develop deep prayer support. If you are addressing these issues, Paul says we're supposed to cast down false imaginations and beliefs that set themselves against God. If you're going to be talking about these issues, you're coming against the enemy, and he will begin to attack you. So our churches and our ministries and our leaders have to have deep prayer support for ourselves. You can expect opposition when you teach about these things and when you talk about them, both outside opposition and within the church or within your ministry as well. Fourth, read, study, and understand the ideology behind LGBT activism. If you want a list of where to start, Kathleen, remind me, and I can send you some great books. Focus on the Family has a transgender resources page and an understanding homosexuality page, where we have articles, videos, books, resources that we've vetted that help explain these issues. Because this is complicated stuff. It's not simple to understand, and you're dealing with deep issues in people's hearts. So read, study, and understand the ideology and what's happening in our culture and how we got here. Again, just a caveat, there are Christian publishers and Christian magazines and Christian individuals who are teaching false ideas about this issue, like the fact that this is your identity, that you can be a gay Christian. And they can believe what the Bible says about sexuality and marriage, but still miss out on some of these other issues. So I would encourage you to use wisdom and discernment. Pastors, you have to talk about these issues from the pulpit. This is not a political issue. This is a moral and biblical issue. And you don't start by hammering on the negative, by talking about, go out there and talk about Sodom and Gomorrah right away. you start by talking about God's good design for men and women, male and female, and how both of those are good, but they're different. And we need each other, and we need both of them. So you have to learn about masculinity and femininity and God's design for that. And then you talk about marriage and relationships and the good that marriage brings, the joy that marriage brings, the new life, the joy, the celebration, the relationship, the kids that come from that, all the good things. So you start with the good. You give people a vision for what God originally intended and what he created us to be. Start with that, not with the negative stuff. Give people a vision for his intentions. You have to talk about sex, being male or female. You also have to address what's happening in the culture. We can't ignore it. Even if you're going through the Bible verse by verse and you're exegetical, you still have to apply some of that to what's happening in the culture. And I'm not saying talk about this all the time, okay? That gets boring. I get bored with it. But yeah, you have to talk about it sometimes. I met a pastor a few years ago. His name's Peter Hubbard. He wrote a book. And he said, just by starting to talk about this and by mentioning people who had left homosexuality, people started coming out of the woodwork, not just with homosexuality, but with pornography, with adultery, with lust, with other issues, because they finally heard the pastor talking about it up front. And so they began, and he had to develop a whole healing ministry and a way to deal with all these people. Give examples of people being freed from sin, bring in people to tell their stories. There's a ton of Christian ministries that are helping people leave homosexuality and transgenderism. You can find some of those stories online at Focus on the Family, but there's other places as well. And I know different ministries in this region as well, in Virginia and Baltimore and Maryland, that are helping people leave homosexuality. Talk about the beliefs behind this system. What I mentioned earlier about what our culture believes about this, and then why those beliefs are wrong and why that's not God's created intent for who we are. And especially we have to address the beliefs about identity, that your sexual orientation is who you are, about transformation. And when I talk about transformation, at Focus we talk about directionality. What's the direction in my life? Am I moving more towards being like Jesus through discipleship and spiritual formation and relationships? It's not like this, wave a magic wand and change. And again, expect opposition from people and from the enemy. You'll need to equip, if you choose to address this, you'll need to equip church leaders, elders, deacons, small group leaders, and especially youth group leaders and even Sunday school teachers. I'm not saying you're going to talk to kids about sex, but you can talk to a little child about how God made us male and female. And there's girls and boys, and they're both good, but they're different from each other. You can talk to small children about this. A friend of mine, Katie Faust, says, you want to be the first person to talk to your kids about these things. You don't want them to learn it at school or from a neighbor or on the streets. You want to be the authority in their lives. And I'm not saying, again, talking to them about, this is not sex ed. This is just people ed. It's about who God made us to be and who he created us to be as men and women. And your youth group leaders need to be on the same page, because I've heard of churches where they're not, and they're undermining what the parents believe and with the children and the young people that they're working with. And so you teach this in age-appropriate ways. I never thought 40 years ago I would have to teach my children what marriage is. But that's where we are today. And so on our website, we have little free resources, downloadable ones. And one of the ones I wrote was how to teach your children about marriage. It just gives really simple ideas about talking about marriage to little kids. There's another one called Raising Children Who Honor Marriage. So free resources like that, how to talk to your kids about homosexuality. When you're out on vacation and you walk into a gay pride parade, what do you say to your kids? This gives you some ideas for that. And again, you start out with the good. What did God design? Who did he make us to be, male and female? What is marriage? Why does God like marriage? Because it protects children. It's a good place to raise children, giving them a mom and a dad. So parents and grandparents, you can all do these things, talking to your kids and your grandkids about it. And then I do believe you have to address these issues in the public square. Couple ideas. In Colorado Springs, we saw that our school boards were going in a direction we didn't want them to go. They were promoting critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion, homosexuality, transgenderism. And so in my church, a gentleman developed a church voter guide, a 501c3 voter guide, and got together with other churches, and we flipped 5 school boards in El Paso County. There are at least 3 or 4 other churches, maybe more, that in Colorado Springs that have within their ministries, you know how you have your women's ministry and your men's ministry and your kids' ministry, they have culture and policy ministries. And one church pulls together people running for school boards and has a debate where anyone can come. My church held a mayoral debate where 2 guys running for mayor came in, and we put together questions, and there was a really big crowd there. But you can make a difference in the public square by doing something small. And I guarantee you, there are people in your church who are interested in politics, but they don't know where to start. They're interested in transforming the culture, but they don't know where to start. So this is a small thing you can do. Just start a culture and policy team. And then there are national groups like the Family Policy Alliance. Along with Focus on the Family, we're connected to 40 state-based groups that help influence culture and policy within their state. And then I think the place where you can have the most impact is probably your local schools. Parents are so busy, and we drop our kids off, and we leave them at the school for 7, 8 hours, and we think that 3 hours on Sunday and a few hours with us in the evening when they're not doing homework is going to be enough. But if the school has them and they're teaching inappropriate things and they have a captive audience, they're the ones that are going to influence your kids along with screen time. That's a whole nother issue, what they're learning on the internet and when they're picking up on their phones. So parents and grandparents, start reading your school's curriculums and textbooks. You have to know what's going on in the classroom. And you have the right to ask the teacher to show you the curriculum. And we created a resource, this is free, Equipping Parents for Back to School. You can find it at equippingparents.org. It's a free resource. It looks at 7 or 8 different areas in education. What's happening in the classroom? What's happening in the library? What did I sign off for when I signed that the health clinic could treat my child or that the counselor can meet with my child? What's going on in sports and restrooms and different areas? And so you can either download one little section or you can download the whole thing at once. And again, it's at equippingparents.org. And it gives you ideas for how to find out what's going on in your school and then combat it when the school's doing things that are not helpful or even harmful for kids. So this one's about sex ed and what schools are teaching with sex ed. So start reading curriculums and textbooks, check the school libraries, attend back-to-school nights and parent-teacher conferences, attend school board meetings, and I know you want to encourage grandparents to get involved. If you have time, help. Put together a curriculum committee to find out what is being taught in your local elementary school, junior high, and high school. One person doesn't have time to read all the textbooks that are there for every single grade. But a group, speed read through, you don't have to read everything, but check out the materials that are being taught. So that's just a few ideas off the top of my head. I want you to keep hope in the midst of all this. If your theme was we're at a tipping point, it does feel like things have shifted a little bit. There is pushback against boys and girls sports and boys and girls private spaces. Whether that's a short window of opportunity You know, it could change with a new administration, with new leadership in your own state. I don't know whether it's short or whether we have a long amount of time to bring revival and change that's going to affect the culture. But I believe that a day is coming when many men and women who struggled with these issues will realize the emptiness and the pain and the brokenness, and they'll want to come to the Lord. And the question is, are our churches going to be ready when that happens? I really believe that's going to happen. But our churches, you know, as well as the culture and policy team, you're going to need a healing prayer team to begin to deal with broken individuals, discipleship programs, deliverance ministries, teaching people how to live in the Spirit, spiritual formation programs, whatever you call it. I know different denominations have different lingo for all those things. But we want to be ready when that happens. And so again, you want to deal with the policy issues, especially what's going on in education, but also with the people. And I do believe they'll be coming into the church. Some of them are already in your churches. Every time I speak on this issue, I have parents and grandparents who come up to me and talk about what their kids are struggling with. And that's probably one of the most painful groups to talk to, because their hearts are breaking. A lot of times they feel guilt and shame. They want it, you know, they don't know what to do. They don't know what happened. Some churches have parents of prodigals groups where the parents are dealing with this issue or other issues. So anyway, I hope I gave you some ideas. Hope I gave you some insight into what's going on in the culture, and some insight into God's heart for our culture and for individuals struggling with these issues. Thank you. I don't know how to turn this off.